Hey there, sleepy one. I know you use these stories to fall asleep, so before you drift off, take a second and drop a like on the video. It helps this little corner of dreamland grow. Tonight's tale is a little different. You're about to step into a desert where memories grow on trees, but pluck one, and the truth might cost you everything. There's a girl named Rosha. She's a memory merchant until she finds a sapling that shouldn't exist. A secret grove that remembers what the world tried to erase. What happens when memories lie? Or worse, what if they're true? Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. And let me take you to a place where forgetting is forbidden, and the trees whisper in a language older than time. This is the orchard of salt and flame. Let the dreaming begin. The memory began like all the others, warm, golden, and just a little too sweet. It pulsed faintly in the jar, cradled in Rosha's hands like a thing still alive. A single strand of light coiled inside the glass, shifting gently as if stirred by an invisible wind. She tilted the vessel against the afternoon sun. The memory danced, flecks of gold, flashes of laughter, the color of ripe figs in summer. Childhood, she guessed. Or a first love. 6 coppers, she said, voice flat. The buyer blinked. He was young, barely old enough to shave, draped in patched silks and sunburnt pride. 6? That's robbery. It's joy, Rosha replied. Untouched. No edits. Look. She lifted the lid a finger's width. The scent escaped like perfume, rain on hot clay, the sharpness of oranges, a girl's laughter echoing in a sunlit courtyard. The boy's face changed. His breath hitched. Rosha sealed the jar. 6, she said again. Or I sell it to the spice merchant with the blind wife. He pays 9 for joy he can smell. The boy's hand trembled as he passed the coins. She watched him walk away with the jar clutched to his chest like a prayer. Rosha tucked the coins into her belt and moved on. Around her, the memory market swelled like a storm about to break. White tents shimmered beneath the heat-drenched sky. Merchants in gold-threaded robes hawked their wares from carpets or carved stalls, their voices a low tide of promises, clarity. Peace. Forget the war. Relive your wedding night. Trade your shame for courage. Everywhere, glass jars glimmered. Some the size of a fingernail. Others larger than a child's skull. Memories curled inside like smoke, each one labeled in chalk or tied with ribbon. One day of grief, no vividness, forget a name, fast-acting taste of mother's stew, sold whole. Rosha passed the usual frauds, powdered recollections ground into ink, fake visions brewed from salt and desert lotus, even illusionists offering dream plays for coin. But her jars were true. She harvested with her own hands. And she never sold a lie. She wove through the tent maze until she reached her spot. A sliver of shade between 2 faded pavilions, marked only by a strip of blue linen. She sat cross-legged and unpacked her wares, 12 jars nestled in a curved wooden rack, each with its own soft glow. Her best fruit was still wrapped in leather, last week's harvest. A bruised but potent memory of betrayal she'd pulled from an old woman who paid to forget her husband's voice. Rosha had cried for hours afterward, though the tears weren't hers. The memory was sharp, and sharpness lingered. She never kept them long. By mid-morning, the air turned molten. The crowd thickened. A man with tattooed eyelids came for a childhood memory of rain. A veiled noblewoman bought a single jar of courage before a duel, never asking who it came from. 2 traders argued over a memory labeled Seaborn Kiss, until Rosha raised the price and sold it to neither. Then came the collector. She saw him before he spoke, a tall figure wrapped in grey, face hidden behind suncloth. His hands were gloved in dyed leather, stitched with strange runes that caught the light. No one else in the market seemed to notice him. But Rosha did. He stopped at her stall. Said nothing. Looking for something specific, she asked. He pointed to the sealed leather pouch. No, she said immediately. He tapped the counter twice. "It's not for sale." He tilted his head. She couldn't see his face, but something about the silence felt heavy. She resisted the urge to reach for the pouch. "It's dangerous," she added, softer. "Not for the untrained." Still nothing. Rocha's mouth went dry. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a mild memory, a desert breeze, a moment of quiet joy, and set it before him. 3 coppers. "Better for you." The man didn't move. Then, slowly, he raised his hand, not toward the jars, but toward her. For a moment, she thought he would touch her face. But instead, his finger extended like a branch, and he pointed just behind her ear. She felt the heat of it without contact. A pulse bloomed against her skull, sharp and strange. She jerked away. "What are you?" But he was already walking. She stood, half ready to follow, but the crowd swallowed him in seconds. Her breath came fast. Around her, the market noise returned like a crashing wave, calls, laughter, wind, bells. She sat slowly. Her fingertips were still tingling. And behind her ear, a memory stirred. That night, she dreamt of the orchard. She was a child again, barefoot, sunburned, standing on a dune that bled salt. Before her rose trees of black bark and curling leaves, each one aflame at its tips. Memora fruit swayed like lanterns, pale and glowing, marked with names she couldn't read. In the dream, she walked between the trunks. The wind smelled like forgotten songs. One fruit dropped into her hands. It bore her name. And then she woke up. Rocha sat upright in her cot, drenched in sweat. Her breath was shallow. The city outside her window murmured in sleep, wind through sandstone alleys, the far-off bleat of goats, the rustle of wind dancers hanging from rooftops. She reached up. Her fingers brushed something soft just behind her ear. A thread. Golden, barely visible. Not real. Not quite. Not hers. By morning, she'd made a decision. She packed only what she needed, 6 sealed jars, a flask of shade water, a pouch of memory seeds, and her knife. The collector's gesture had planted something. Not just a memory, but a direction. West. Into the salt wind. Toward the orchard. The one they all whispered about but no one admitted to seeing. The orchard of salt and flame. Where memories grew wild. Where truth bloomed like fire. Where no one left unchanged. The wind changed on the 3rd morning, and with it came salt. It rode in quiet, as if it had been walking a long way, past the bone-colored hills and forgotten wells, past the ruined wind towers and the slow-turning sky. It pressed against the back of Rocha's neck with invisible fingers, and she felt it in her marrow before she ever tasted it on her lips. She paused on the ridge. The desert stretched vast and still before her, every dune wave carved from light and silence. Far below, her camel shifted its weight with a groan, and the sand slipped loose around its hooves. Rocha held the wind. Yes, there it was. Salt. Dry and old and heavy as a secret. She stepped down the slope without a word. The journey had taken her beyond the last known village, past the black glass fields where lightning had once struck the dunes so fiercely it turned them to obsidian. She had followed no map, only the tug of something stranger than instinct. The thread behind her ear had not vanished. If anything, it glowed brighter by the day, visible only at dusk, when the sun bled sideways through the air and the sky turned the color of forgotten bruises. She did not know where the orchard was. But her feet seemed to. By midday, the sand changed. No longer gold, but white and brittle. Crusted with lines that looked like veins or old rivers. She stooped and touched it. Salt. And underneath, flame glass. Sharp and red and glinting in the cracks. The camel balked. She let it go. There are places, she had been told, that beasts will not tread. This was one of them. She walked alone, now. The salt grew thicker, crunching underfoot. The sun burned high, then began its slow descent. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and every gust of wind whispered in tongues older than men. And then she saw the tree. At first, she thought it a mirage, a trick of heat and distance. But it did not shimmer or dance like false things do. It stood, real and still, atop a low hill of salt. A sapling, no taller than she was, its bark black as burned wood, its leaves curled like flame caught mid-motion. At the tip of each branch, a pale orb pulsed like the moon. Each one no bigger than a plum, glowing faintly as if lit from within. She climbed the hill. The tree did not move. It made no sound. But something in its silence unsettled her. A quiet not of peace, but of watching. She reached out, slow as sleep. Her fingers brushed one of the fruits. Warm. Alive. It pulsed, and the thread behind her ear pulled tight. Her heart stuttered. She turned the fruit. And there, scratched delicately into its skin in a language she had not spoken since she was a girl. Rosha. Daughter of Luma. Born of fire, lost to the decree. She snatched her hand back as if burned. A memra fruit bearing her name. Her mother's name. A name no record was meant to remember. Rosha took a step back. Her throat felt tight. The decree of erasure had been absolute, ritual and ink, fire and water. Her childhood, her bloodline, her very origin struck from scroll and city alike. She had not spoken her true name aloud in 10 years. And yet here it was. Growing. She looked at the sapling. No other fruits bore markings. Just this one. Just hers. It should not have been possible. Memories could not grow unplanted. That was the law of the orchard. You sow a thought, a grief, a truth. You bury it in salt. You speak the binding. And only then, with sun and season, might it take root. But she had never planted this. She circled the tree. No other footprints marked the hill. The salt beneath it was undisturbed, clean and unbroken. The tree had risen of its own accord. Or worse, it had remembered itself. She sat down at the base, breath coming shallow. The desert murmured. She closed her eyes. And the fruit dropped. Softly, like a sigh. It landed in her lap. Rosha did not move for a long time. When she finally opened her eyes, the light had changed. The sun had dipped low, staining the sky red and copper. The fruit sat heavy and warm against her legs, its surface now flickering faintly, as if something within it stirred. She picked it up. And bit. The world shuddered. Not the sky, nor the earth, but the world within her. Her vision blurred. A sharp taste of smoke. Ash in her mouth. Heat, not from the sun, but from fire. She saw her mother's eyes. Heard her name spoken in full. Felt her small hands gripping something wooden and charred, the sting of running barefoot across hot stone, the echo of a lullaby half-sung, cut off by men in black robes who came without sound, without warning, with scrolls in one hand and silver knives in the other. And then darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the kind pressed down by power. Erasure. She fell back, gasping. The fruit tumbled from her hands and cracked against the salt. From its broken skin, a thread of light spilled, rising like smoke, twisting once, then dissolving into the dusk. Rosha lay still. Her face was wet. She did not remember crying. Above her, the sapling stood silent. But something in the air had changed. A door had been opened. And somewhere, far from this hill, someone would know. She had remembered. She had broken the decree. The salt wind rose again, sharper this time. The orchard was waking. And it had not forgotten her. The sky had turned a strange color by the time Rosha found her feet. Not the red gold of dusk, nor the bruised violet of true night, but something in between, like ink diluted with fire. The salt plains shimmered faintly underfoot, reflecting the last light as though they remembered stars. Rosha gathered her satchel with shaking hands. The cracked memora fruit still lay at her feet, leaking its final threads into the air like smoke trailing from a dying flame. She crouched beside it, fingers brushing the broken skin, but no more visions came. It was spent. The truth had already bloomed. Her truth. The taste of it lingered in her mouth, ash, honey, the sharp tang of loss. Her tongue felt too large, as if the memory had settled there and taken root. She looked up at the sapling. It hadn't moved, but something about it felt different. Taller, perhaps. Or darker. The bark now gleamed with a faint red sheen, as though pulsing from within. It was no ordinary tree. No orchard grew itself. No fruit named itself. No memory could be born without a sower. But this one had. Which meant it hadn't come from her alone. Someone had planted it for her. Rosha circled the sapling slowly, her boots crunching through the salt crust. She knelt at its base, scraping away the white dust with her hands until her fingers struck something hard. Wood. Smooth and deliberate. She uncovered a sliver of carved plank, half buried beneath the roots. Old and weathered, but still legible. Letters, painted in deep blue. Seeded by order. Witnessed by flame. Marked for return. Her breath caught. She knew the phrasing. Order. Flame. Marked. They were old words. Forbidden ones. They belonged to the salt-bearers. The salt-bearers were not spoken of openly. They were ghosts in the public record. Names scratched from stone, stories left unfinished, rumors draped in robes. Once, long ago, they had tended the great orchards of memory that spanned the continent, places of healing, remembrance, even prophecy. But in time, they had changed. Or perhaps the world had. They had begun choosing which memories lived. Which were buried. Which rulers remembered kindness, and which remembered fear. Kings woke believing in wars that had never happened. Treaties were signed on the strength of false brotherhoods. And when the people began to ask too many questions, the salt-bearers were driven into shadow. Erased, like Rosha. Except, she now saw, they had not vanished. They had hidden in the soil. In the trees. In her. She sat back on her heels, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from her braid. The salt plains stretched around her, wide and open, but she no longer felt alone. There was something watching. Not the tree. Not the wind. Something farther. A presence, deep in the world's bones. Awake and listening. Rosha pressed her hand to the ground. It was warm. Not with sun, but with memory. Beneath her palm, something moved. A rhythm. Like a heartbeat. She snatched her hand back. The tree gave a soft sound, not quite a creak, not quite a whisper. Its leaves shimmered red and gold, and one by one, they began to fall. They did not flutter like normal leaves. They dropped straight down, fast and heavy, and where they landed, the salt hissed like water hitting fire. The leaves melted into the earth, each one glowing briefly before vanishing into the ground. A message, she thought. A summoning. The orchard was not done with her. Rosha stood, her knees aching. Her limbs felt hollow, as if the memory had drained something vital from her. She knew what had to be done. She would go west. The sapling was just the beginning. A seed, yes, but seeds grow. And somewhere out there, beyond the salt and stone, the full orchard still lived. The true one. The one the world had forgotten. Or been made to forget. If the salt-bearers had marked her for return, then she would return. Not as a pawn. Not as a witness. But as something else. As the one who remembered. She turned her back on the sapling. The wind howled across the flats, and behind her, the hill burned red for a moment. No fire, no heat, only light. Then darkness fell, sudden and absolute. And Russia walked into it. The past was not a place Russia liked to visit. It came with no warning, no road signs. Just shadows around corners and names that caught in her throat like bone. Sometimes it came as a scent, a certain kind of smoke, a whiff of cinnamon in the wrong alley, and she'd be 5 years old again, hiding beneath the kitchen table while her mother whispered words not meant for children. This time, the past arrived in ink. She found the record in a sun-baked outpost 3 days west of the sapling, tucked into a forgotten archive inside a merchant shrine. She hadn't meant to go looking. But as soon as she saw the blue and silver crest carved above the lintel, the Office of Names and Memory, something in her feet made the decision for her. The clerk was old and nearly blind. He didn't recognize her name. That was the point. Russia asked to see the erased ledger, the one bound in black hide with salt-stamped corners, usually locked in the deepest drawer. The clerk hesitated. She showed him one of her memory jars, uncorked just enough for the scent to rise, cloves, burnt parchment, and a cry in the dark. He handed her the key without a word. Inside, the pages crackled with heat, every line a ghost. The decree of erasure was a ritual older than laws, older even than the Council of Cities. It had begun as mercy, once, used to unmake the memories of cursed bloodlines, to erase knowledge too dangerous to hold. A family marked by a prophet's dream. A child born on a wrong star. But in time, mercy had become control. One name struck through here. Another vanished there. And then whole lineages vanished, their memories quietly buried beneath official silence. Their stories never ended, they were simply snuffed out, mid-sentence. Russia turned page after page. And there it was. Her name. Not the name she used now, not Russia of the market, or Russia the memory taker. No, this was her full name, rare and unwieldy as old stone. Rashana Diluma Itahil. Next to it, the mark, a flame drawn in silver ink. The sign of total cleansing. There were no reasons listed. No charges. Just a date and a decree number written in careful script. By order of the Council of Salt and Truth, the Luma line shall be forgotten. She ran her finger over the ink. It should have faded. Decrees this old usually did. But the page was hot, the lettering vivid, as if it had been written only yesterday. And suddenly she remembered. Not the fire, not the scream, not the night they came for her family. She remembered the sound of the knife sliding across parchment. Not to hurt, but to cut. Clean, deep, final. She had been made to forget. Not just her mother's face or her family's name. She had been made to forget herself. It was why she sometimes awoke unsure of her own voice. Why she couldn't recall her father's laugh, even though she remembered loving it. It was why she felt like a shadow walking in someone else's shape. The salt bearers hadn't just erased her from the world. They had rewritten her into silence. She closed the book. Her hands were shaking. A line of sweat ran down her spine. Outside, the wind stirred the shrine's hanging bells. The sound was soft and mournful, like a lullaby sung with no words. She stood. The clerk did not stop her. He only watched with clouded eyes as she walked past, her boots thudding lightly on the winding tighter, calling her west, toward the orchard that remembered her, even when she could not. Russia wrapped her headscarf tighter against the wind. Then she turned her back on the shrine and kept walking. By the time Russia returned to the market at Firam's crossing, she no longer felt like a memory merchant. The journey back had taken 6 days, and each mile had stretched her thinner, tugged at her thoughts like threads unraveling in the wind. She walked in silence and slept without dreaming, but her body remembered. Her hand still reached for jars that weren't there. Her ears still listened for the soft sigh of fruit falling from the branch. Her feet still paused before tents she had never visited, as if some old part of her knew their shape. And always, behind her ear, the golden thread hummed faintly, like a quiet song growing stronger. Firam's crossing had not changed. It never did. The market still glimmered in the early light. White tents pitched along the river's bend, flapping lazily in the wind like sails waiting for direction. The banners still bore their inked sigils: memory bought, memory sold, regret made gentle. Even the same toothless boy offered her dried figs and tried to scam her out of a copper. But Russia was not the same. And she did not come to trade. She passed the merchant rows without pause. A spice seller called her name, her market name, the one she had used for years, and she waved him off with a distracted hand. She had no memory to sell. No lies to sweeten. Only the growing certainty that something was about to shift. She stopped at her old spot, a sliver of shade between two canopies, just wide enough for her rack and a mat. It was empty. No one had claimed it. But someone had left something. Laid carefully in the center of the mat was a single jar. It was sealed in wax, and there was no label. Russia crouched. Her heart thumped once, twice. The jar was warm to the touch. Inside, the memory shimmered faintly, dark and slow, like oil in water. It wasn't joy, or grief, or fear. It was regret. Heavy and old. And it was hers. She knew it before she even opened it. Her fingers hesitated on the seal. Someone had extracted this from her. Recently. And without her knowing. Which meant someone had been close enough to touch her mind. Only a salt-bearer could have done it. Russia stood quickly, scanning the market. The scent of sweet smoke and dates hung heavy in the air. Traders haggled. Camels brayed. Nothing seemed out of place. But she felt it. Eyes. Not one pair. Many. She tucked the jar into her satchel and moved, slow and steady, toward the back alleys behind the saffron tents. It was a winding maze of narrow paths and shaded passages where the air smelled of old stone and sour herbs. Here, the market's noise faded, swallowed by the cool hush of sandstone walls. She stopped beneath a crumbling arch and turned. "You've been following me," she said quietly. No one answered. But the air shifted. A figure stepped from the shadows. She had seen him once before. Not clearly. Just a flicker at the edge of her dream when she first bit into the memra fruit. A man wrapped in desert gray, with no name and no face. "Salt-bearer?" she asked. He said nothing. He reached into his sleeve and withdrew something small and black. A seed. He held it out. She did not move. "What is it?" she asked. His voice, when it came, was dry as old parchment. "Regret. Unplanted." She looked at it. Small. Smooth. Ordinary. And somehow, or hers. "How did you?" But the man was already walking away. "Wait," she called. He paused, just for a moment. Not turning. "Flesh forgets," he said, "but salt remembers. You're not the only one they've rewritten." Then he vanished into the alleys. Russia stared at the seed in her palm. It was warm. Everything was warm now. Too warm. Like the orchard was getting closer. Or waking up. She left the alley and climbed to the rooftop of a shuttered bathhouse, where the wind blew sharp and clean. From here, she could see the edge of the desert, where the dunes rose like sleeping gods and the sun spilled molten gold across the world. She held up the seed. If she planted it, it would grow. It always did. But what would it bloom? A memory? A warning? A lie? Or the truth, at last? She closed her fist around it and whispered the first line of the binding, just once. "I do not fear what I have forgotten." Then she turned toward the west again. Toward the orchard. toward whatever waited. Night fell across the desert like spilled ink. The stars came in waves, sharp and bright and countless, far brighter than they ever were in the cities. Each one a cold eye watching. Each one a memory not yet named. Russia traveled by moonlight. The path westward was unmarked. There were no signposts, no way stations, no trade routes through these lands. But the golden thread behind her ear had begun to tug like a needle drawing toward the hem of a long-forgotten garment. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was guidance. Soft, firm, insistent. Like the pull of gravity, or the feel of a word you haven't yet spoken but somehow already know. By the third night, she reached the canyon. It was shallow at first, then steepened into sharp, splintering cliffs. The stars vanished here, blotted out by the sheer black of the stone, and the wind grew quiet, as though even it dared not breathe too loudly. Strange formations jutted from the earth, towers of petrified wood, twisted into impossible shapes. She passed through a field of these husks, and they whispered as she moved between them, not in sound, but in feeling. It was like walking through someone else's thoughts. And then she saw her. The Watcher. She stood perfectly still on the edge of a salt shelf, facing the cliff wall. Wrapped head to toe in white, veil flowing behind her like smoke. She did not turn as Russia approached. She did not move at all. Russia stopped 10 paces back. "You've been watching me," she said softly. The figure's voice, when it came, was neither young nor old. "I was watching the tree." "You planted it." "No," the Watcher said. "The tree planted itself." Russia stepped closer. "But you were waiting." "I was remembering." Silence stretched between them. The moonlight painted the salt in shades of silver and frost. Russia felt the weight of the jar in her satchel, the unmarked regret, still sealed. The seed sat tucked into her belt pouch, warm even now. The Watcher turned at last. Her eyes were uncovered, clear, pale gray, almost colorless. But they were not empty. They were ancient. "You are a daughter of Luma," she said. Russia nodded. "That name was taken from me. No name is ever truly lost. Only misplaced. Or hidden." The Watcher stepped closer. "The tree you found is only one branch of a much older grove. The saltbearers tend many like it. Some grow from hope. Others from fear. Yours was grown from silence." Russia swallowed. "Why me?" The Watcher studied her for a long moment. "You were erased," she said. "But not completely. The wound remained. We follow the scars. You want to recruit me. We want to remember you." Russia didn't answer. Not right away. The wind stirred between them. "I remember bits now," she said finally. "But it's like holding smoke. I want it all." "You'll get it," said the Watcher. "If you're willing to bleed for it." Russia looked at the white figure, and then past her, toward the canyon's edge. "What is this place?" she asked. The Watcher turned and raised her hand. The cliff face shimmered. Then split. Not like stone cracking, but like a memory opening. A narrow doorway formed in the rock, rimmed in faint red light. The air that poured from it was cool and heavy, laced with salt and something sweeter, familiar, and strange. "Below us," the Watcher said, "lies the archive of the rootless. Every memory ever cut from the world lives here. The ones kings burned. The ones prophets buried. The ones that refused to die. Mine too. Perhaps," she said. "If you dare to seek it." Russia stepped forward. And the thread behind her ear pulsed once, hard. She knew, without doubt, that this was a line she could not cross back over. If she entered, she would leave behind more than just the world above. But she stepped forward anyway. And the Watcher in white followed her into the dark. The doorway closed behind them without sound. Russia did not look back. The air in the archive of the Rootless was cool and damp, but dry with age, like the inside of a sealed jar or the breath of an old crypt. Stone walls glowed with faint veins of salt, and the floor sloped downward, spiraling gently as if carved by a patient river of time. Rosh's footsteps echoed in rhythms she didn't recognize. The Watcher made none at all. They passed alcoves filled with forgotten names. Some were carved into tablets. Others hung on ribbons of sandcloth. Others still flickered in the air, not written, but remembered, shimmering only when you weren't looking directly at them. She paused before one such shimmer. Just for a breath. "What is this?" she asked. "A child's first word," the Watcher said. "Erased during the Treaty of Winds. Spoken only once, then struck from her mother's mouth." Rosha moved on, quietly. At last they reached a chamber. It was round and low, built from lead stone and lined with cracked mirrors. At its center stood a shallow basin, filled with a dark red oil that shimmered faintly, as if lit from beneath. The scent of it made Rosha's pulse slow. Not because it was calming, but because it remembered blood. The Watcher stepped to the far side of the basin and extended a pale hand. "You've tasted a memory from the orchard," she said. "You've seen your own root. But that is only the first bloom." She reached into a small pouch at her belt and drew forth a tool. A blade. Its handle was made of polished bone, its edge black with salt crystal. Not sharp in the way of steel, but glinting with an old magic, the kind that didn't cut flesh, it cut meaning. Rosha's throat went dry. "This is the knife of marking," said the Watcher. "You will use it only once." "On what?" she asked, though she already knew. "Yourself." The Watcher gestured, and a low stone bench rose beside the basin. Rosha sat slowly, her back straight, her palms open on her knees. "What happens if I refuse?" The Watcher tilted her head. "Then you leave. We close the way. You go back to the surface, and you forget you were ever followed. And if I do it, then the orchard will know you. You will carry the mark of memory in your skin. A map that only truth can read." Rosha stared at the blade in the Watcher's hand. Her mind searched for the sensible thing. The smart choice. But nothing in her life had ever been built on safety. She had survived erasure, isolation, exile, and now something ancient was calling her by name. She held out her hand. The Watcher placed the knife gently in her palm. Rosha turned the blade, letting it catch the red glow of the basin. She breathed once, then twice, and pressed the blade to her forearm. It did not hurt as she expected. The edge split her skin like water divides for a boat, clean, quiet, deep. The blood that rose was not red, but silver gold. It shimmered faintly as it spilled down into the basin. And as it touched the oil, the room changed. The mirrors flared with memory. Not reflections, but remembrances. Faces she had known as a child. The curve of her mother's voice. A firelit courtyard. Hands grasping hers in the dark. A boy with cold dark eyes singing nonsense songs. Her past. Unfolding. Written not in words, but in wounds. The Watcher moved to her side. With the tip of a second blade, she traced the bleeding line on Rosha's arm, not to deepen it, but to shape it. The cut bent. Curved. Forked. Became more than a wound. It became a map. And in it, Rosha saw paths. Desert routes she had never walked. Hidden cities. Memory wells. Route archives. Even the orchard trees, faint and flickering, moving like stars drifting in sand. "These," said the Watcher, "are the places that remember you." Rosha stared down at the wound, no longer bleeding. It glowed now, like fire beneath skin. "How do I follow them?" "When the time is right," said the Watcher, "they will burn again." Rosha stood. Her legs felt stronger than they had a moment ago. She no longer shook. She no longer doubted. I'm ready, she said. The watcher bowed slightly. Then she raised a single hand. The mirrors turned dark. The basin went still. And from the floor behind them, a new passage opened, narrow, arched, lined in memory threads that pulsed faintly like veins. The salt-bearers wait in the flame gallery, said the watcher. You'll meet them one by one. They'll test your mind, your memory, and your mercy. Mercy? Rosha asked. The watcher did not answer. Only smiled, for the first time. A thin, almost sorrowful smile. You'll see, she said. And Rosha stepped into the dark once more. The corridor narrowed as she walked, until Rosha had to turn sideways and duck her head. The walls were no longer stone, but salt, pressed tight and crystalline, humming faintly beneath her fingertips. The glow from her marked forearm lit the passage just enough to see. The air smelled like the orchard did, scorched petals and distant rain. When the tunnel opened again, she stepped into a round chamber unlike anything she'd yet seen. It was not built. It was grown. The walls were roots, thick and gnarled and webbed with veins of fireglass, pulsing softly like embers under bark. Dozens of memra fruits hung from these roots, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. Each glowed a different color, soft blue, harsh red, pale green, and each was tethered to a carved wooden stand below, as if the room itself had grown to cradle them. A figure waited in the center, kneeling beside a bed of soil. Not just any soil. It shimmered. Like stardust ground into earth. The kneeling figure rose without sound and turned to face her. This one wore no veil. His face was creased and sun-darkened, eyes sharp as obsidian chips, framed by a manet of white braids twisted with black thread. I am Kareth, he said. Keeper of roots. Sower of flame. Rosha inclined her head. She wanted to speak, wanted to ask what this place was, what those fruits contained, what that soil was made from. But the words didn't come. He didn't seem to mind. You've come to plant, Kareth said. She nodded. He reached into a pouch at his hip and withdrew a small flask of salt oil, the color of liquid brass. He poured a single drop into the soil and it hissed, rising in a short flame before vanishing into smoke. The rite is old, he said. Older than the council. Older than the language we speak it in now. He offered her a knife. Not for skin. This one was carved entirely of bone, pale and ancient, with a hollow in its hilt where a seed might sit. Choose a memory, he said. A true one. One you have not spoken aloud in years. Speak it. Hold it. Then give it to the soil. Rosha stepped forward. The soil shimmered, waiting. She opened her hand. The regret seed was still there. Warm. Unspoken. She held it above the soil. And spoke. I once watched my mother be taken, she said, voice barely audible. And I did nothing. Not because I wanted to. Because I was afraid. I hid. I let them take her. I don't even remember if she screamed. The words hurt. More than she expected. As if saying them aloud was the same as living them again. Kareth nodded. Now hold it. She pressed the seed to her forehead, just once. It burned. Memory surged, her mother's eyes, wide in the dark, the shape of the door closing, the crack of sandals on stone. Rosha gasped and dropped the seed into the soil. It sank with no sound. Kareth stepped forward and placed both hands over the spot where it had fallen. He began to chant, not in the common tongue, but in something older. A slow, rolling language like a river moving over bone. The words vibrated through the room, and the roots on the walls pulsed in rhythm, as if they were listening. Then the soil stirred. A thin stalk burst upward. It grew in seconds. A single fruit unfurled at its top, dark red, rimmed in silver light. Kareth plucked it and placed it in her hands. This is what your regret became, he said. Rosha stared down at it. The fruit was warm, but heavier than it should have been. She felt its weight not just in her fingers, but in her chest. "What is it?" she asked. "Truth," he said. "Or a lie? You won't know until you taste it." She looked at him. "And if I don't?" "Then it grows heavy. And it grows alone. Some fruits, if not eaten, burst. And when they do," he trailed off, "they change you. Without your choosing." She turned the fruit over. Her fingers trembled. And then, without giving herself time to fear it, she bit. It tasted like smoke. And salt. And the sound of her own name screamed in a child's voice. The chamber vanished. She stood in the alley behind her old home, pressed against the wall, small and shivering. Her mother's hand clutched hers. They were running. She remembered that now. Running, not hiding. And her mother had turned. Faced the men. Shoved Rosha into a clay barrel of rainwater. Whispered, "Stay quiet. No matter what." Rosha remembered the sound of the door breaking. The scream. The silence. She gasped. The chamber returned. The fruit was gone. Kareth was watching her with eyes like burned coal. "What did you see?" "A truth," Rosha whispered. He nodded. "Then your sewing is complete." She sank to her knees. She did not cry. But she could have. Because now she knew. The salt-bearers did not just manipulate memory. They made you carry it. They made you wear it. And they made you choose. The council had many names. In the tongues of the north, they were the keepers of dust. In the mountain courts, they were the crownless hands. In the great cities carved into the cliffs of the southern gulfs, they were simply called the ones who watch. But in the language Rosha had once spoken at her mother's knee, the one no longer taught in schools, they were called by their truest name. The shapers of silence. They did not rule from thrones or wear rings of office. They sat behind stone walls veined with memory threads, cloaked in salt and sealed in law. Their faces never entered history books, but their hands shaped every page. If a ruler lost his peace of mind, the council had adjusted it. If a war ended before it began, it was because they had reached into a general's childhood and tied off a thread of violence. They did not erase randomly. They erased with purpose. And now, one of their erased was growing loud. Rosha did not know she was being followed until she left the archive. The desert greeted her like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The wind smelled different, less of dust, more of ash. The sky was clear, but the birds were gone. Too quiet. She mounted the borrowed sand-runner Kareth had given her, a wiry, long-legged beast that moved like water across dunes, and made her way toward the city of Serre Vale, where the oldest memory trade routes converge. Tavern carved into the ribs of an old salt beast, a blind card reader felt her presence before she spoke and refused to deal his cards. In a well house on the edge of the Red Market, an old woman gave her water and slipped her a warning beneath the bowl. "They know you've tasted a fruit. Run." By the third night, she saw her first pursuer. Not a mercenary. Not a bandit. A council warden. Dressed in linen white, with gloves embroidered in silver thread, and a staff capped with a ring of petrified memory glass. He did not look at her directly. He stood across the square, watching a flame dancer perform in a circle of dust. But he was not watching the fire. He was watching reflections. Rosha turned before he could catch hers. She slipped into the crowd and vanished down the alleys. She didn't breathe again until she reached the rooftops. She crouched in the shadow of a chimney and opened her satchel. The sowed fruit was gone. Its memory had passed. But the jar, the one she had found at her stall, heavy with regret not her own, still sat there, sealed in wax. She stared at it. Her fingers itched. Everything in her said, "Now is not the time. Not with eyes on you." not with the world shifting beneath your feet. But something else, older, deeper, whispered, "This memory is your warning." She unsealed it. The regret spilled out not in light or scent, but in sound. A voice. Her mother's voice. Not speaking to her, but about her. She must forget. There's no other way. If she remembers, they'll come for her. The seed will bloom, and everything we burned will return. Rosha froze. The vision struck. She saw her mother kneeling in a circle of salt-bearers, barefoot, hair unbound, arms inked with burning glyphs. The fire in the center was not flame but memory, swirling, flickering, alive. A decree was being read aloud. Rosha's name. Her name, spoken in full. Her fate, spelled out. Not erased by force, but sacrificed by her own blood. The memory faded. Rosha sat back hard against the chimney wall, mouth dry. Her mother had chosen this. Chose to have her daughter forgotten. To protect her? To hide her? Or because? Rosha swallowed the thought before it could root. Below, the square bustled. But she knew the silence that followed her now wasn't in the streets. It was in the air. The council had seen the orchard bloom again. And they were listening. Not for her footsteps, but for her memory. And somewhere in Surrey Vale, they would try to take it back. Beneath the markets of Surrey Vale, the sand burns. Not with flame, but with memory. Rosha learned this from a map stitched into skin. It was Kareth who had given it to her, unrolling a length of tanned hide inked with threads of dark crimson and silver, wrapped around a rib bone carved with runes. She had expected a scroll. Instead, he had offered her a tattooed fragment of a man who no longer lived. This, he said, is the last known entrance to the Flame Archive. It lies beneath Surrey Vale, but it is not Surrey Vale. It was built before the city. Before names. Rosha had memorized it. Now she crouched behind a spice cart in the night market, waiting for the guards to pass. The sigil on her forearm glowed faintly beneath her sleeve, nervous, alive. It had begun doing that more often. Responding to things unseen. She ducked into a tannery alley and slipped through a broken wall. Then down a staircase swallowed in shadow. The air grew colder as she descended. Then hotter. Not like sunlight heat. Like breath. The smell of charred parchment and saltstone rose with each step. And then, the passage opened. She entered a chamber built of fused glass. The walls shimmered red and gold, melted into strange curves. Stalactites of memory thread hung from the ceiling like dripping time. In the center stood a plinth, and on it, a bowl filled with black sand that glowed from beneath. A whisper rose from it the moment she stepped close. Not a voice. A memory. One not her own. A man, sobbing in a language she did not know. Flames consuming a city. A child handed over for safekeeping, not because she was loved, but because she remembered too much. Rosha gripped the edge of the plinth. These were planted memories. Not harvested from life. Not grown through regret. Built. By hand. By art. By something ancient and forbidden. She looked closer. The bowl of sand was not solid. It was shifting, slowly, constantly, like something underneath was alive. Occasionally, a shape would emerge, half a face, a fragment of a name, a symbol, and vanish again beneath the surface. She reached out. And touched it. The sand rushed upward in a whirl, engulfing her hand. Her mind jolted. She saw a woman standing at the gates of a palace, lips parted in a lie she didn't know was planted in her. A king who loved his son until a memory was inserted that convinced him the child had betrayed him. A priest who forgot an entire prophecy and built a temple upon false words. All engineered. All shaped. Not forgotten, not lost. Given. She pulled her hand back, gasping, The sand hissed. A single phrase rose from it in a dozen voices. "You are not the first." Rosha stepped back. The floor beneath her feet shimmered faintly, lines of light forming a pattern. A seal. A glyph she had seen once before in the Saltbearer's archive, Axis root. Not a place. A lever. She knelt and brushed her fingers across it. The glyph lit, white hot. And a section of the floor cracked open. From beneath rose a capsule. Glass-veined. In its heart, a fruit. Not like the ones grown from trees. It was pale and crystalline, humming with unnatural light. Its stem was metal. Its markings were wrong, etched in a hand not made for ink or life. This fruit had never grown. It had been forged. Rosha stared. The council wasn't just shaping the world through memory. They were manufacturing false truths, planting them not in trees, but in minds. No wonder the orchard burned at its edges. It was being fed lies. And someone, somewhere, was preparing to plant another. Her knees trembled. She tucked the forged fruit into her satchel, sealing it inside a fold of salt cloth. She did not know who it had been meant for. A ruler? A warlord? A child? But she knew one thing. If the orchard tasted this, if someone harvested it believing it to be truth, it would not bear memory. It would bear fire. She turned and ran. Back through the melting glass hall. Back through the stairs. Out into the night, where the market lights flickered like watchful eyes and the salt wind smelled not of rain, but of war. The message came wrapped in flame-petal cloth, sealed with a drop of solidified memory sap. It arrived on her cot while she was away, slipped beneath her pack like a gift or a trap. She found it at dawn. It smelled faintly of orange blossoms and burned parchment. She did not open it until nightfall. The note inside was short. No title. No signature. Just a place, a time, and one line written in the sharp, slanted script of the Saltbearers. A lie can preserve more than truth ever could. Rosha read it twice, then tucked it into her sleeve and walked to the edge of the city. The sun had already fallen behind the canyon teeth, and the wind carried sand and whispers. She followed the instructions through dry ravines and over salt-slick stone until she reached a stone arch that shimmered faintly with protective glyphs. Two figures waited there, hooded, silent. They said nothing as they let her pass. Beyond the arch lay a garden. Not of trees, but of memory fonts. Fountains made of carved glass rose from the ground, each bubbling with memory-infused water. Some ran clear. Others shimmered in color. One was blood red. Another black as night. A few had dried completely, emptied long ago. The central pool glowed blue, and beside it stood a woman in gray. Tall, wrapped in layers of gauze, with no weapons and no veil. Rosha recognized her immediately. Hisoa Illareth. The oldest salt-bearer still walking the surface. Said to have lived long enough to remember when the orchard first sang. "I know your face," Illareth said. "But not your truth." "I know what the council has done," Rosha replied. "What they are still doing." Illareth nodded, as if this were expected. "They have always shaped memory. The Saltbearers once guided their hand. Now we work against it. But not always in the way you think." She gestured to the pool. "Look." Rosha stepped closer. The water shifted. A vision formed. A young monarch, barely older than Rosha. Lean, hawk-eyed, pacing the edge of a war table. His voice rang with anger. Behind him, advisors barked grievances. A map lay sprawled open, border lines drawn thick with red ink. Armies marked with bone. Siege plans drafted and signed. The king spoke one word. "Tomorrow." Illareth's voice was quiet. "He believes the neighboring kingdom poisoned his brother." A belief forged not by fact, but by fragments, one real memory twisted, another erased. The council shaped his grief to sharpen into vengeance. Tomorrow, he will declare holy war. Russia felt her gut twist. And you want me to stop it? No, Illyris said. We want you to make a choice. She lifted something from a satchel at her side. A memora fruit. Forged. Russia recognized the texture immediately. Etched with the false glyphs. Inside it, a memory. False, but precise. A day when the king and his supposed enemy shared childhood laughter in a secret courtyard. A memory of brotherhood, never lived, never earned, but utterly believable. If we plant it in him, said Illyris, he will awaken changed. Not completely, but just enough. He will pause. Delay the war. Perhaps end it. Russia took the fruit. It pulsed in her hand, gentle, sweet, wrong. If I do this, she said, I'm no better than the council. Illyris's eyes darkened. Then let him burn cities to ashes for a truth that was bent. Let his grief birth widows. Russia shook her head. There must be another way. There isn't, said Illyris. And that, more than anything, sounded honest. They stood in silence. The fruit pulsed once more. And in that heartbeat, Russia saw. The 1,000 refugees marching into the sand, the fire raining on glass towns, the screams of children whose names would be forgotten, the slow growth of regret in a king who never questioned his own certainty. Could she stop that? With one lie? Or would she simply plant a new wound that would one day bloom into another war? I won't plant it, she said. Illyris said nothing. I'll speak to him, Russia added. Now Illyris's lips curved, almost kindly. No one listens when truth walks in a girl's mouth, she said. But they always taste memory. Russia turned and walked away. The fruit still in her hand. Its warmth bled into her palm. And in her heart, a truth. She would not use it. But she would not destroy it either. Because a lie, no matter how wrong, is still a seed. And she was learning how to hold it without letting it grow. The first letter came by shadow. Slipped beneath her flask at a roadside fire pit while she slept. The parchment was thin. The ink faded. The words brief. We remember you. We remember ourselves. Meet us where names are carved into stone but no lips dare speak them. It was unsigned. Russia burned it after reading. But the word stayed. She knew the place. Every city had one, a memory wall carved generations ago, once used to honor the dead, now left abandoned when the council decreed that no name could be spoken unless written and sanctioned. The wall in Serre Vale lay in the lower quarter, behind the old dye vats. She waited until moonrise, when the city streets were quiet and the bells had ceased their ringing. The wall had crumbled over the years. Ivy choked its base. Most of the names were weather-worn, lost to time. But someone had scrubbed them clean. Russia blinked. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of names had been uncovered by hand. Some repainted. Others scratched deeper into the stone. And above them all, written in ash. We do not forget. She turned slowly. Figures stepped from the shadows. Men and women. A few children. Wrapped in mismatched cloaks and hand-woven veils. One woman wore a necklace of old ink quills. Another held a knife carved from petrified fruitwood. A boy's forearm shimmered faintly, glow thread, just like hers. They were not warriors. But they were survivors. One man stepped forward. His face was lean, dust-scarred, but his voice had weight. They erased our names, he said. But not our memories. Some of us remembered in dreams. Others in nightmares. And some, like you, through flame. Russia opened her mouth. But had no words. He continued. We call ourselves the remembered. Every kingdom has some. Every street. Every market. We walk among the living, quietly. Waiting. For what? She asked. For someone like you. A murmur passed through the gathered. You returned from the orchard, said the quill-wearing woman. You spoke your name. You sowed a regret and survived its bloom. You carry a forged fruit and have not planted it, added another. That means you've tasted power and still choose restraint. Rosha felt herself flush. I didn't choose anything, she muttered. I'm just trying to understand what they did to me. The man smiled. And in that, you've become dangerous. A child approached her. Young, perhaps 9. Eyes sharp. She held something wrapped in cloth. Rosha knelt. The girl offered it wordlessly. Rosha unwrapped it. A jar. Faintly glowing. Inside, her memory. Her own face, flickering in the glass. But younger. Laughing. Running barefoot through a garden she didn't recognize. The child whispered, "It's yours." My father remembered it, but didn't know why. Rosha's heart twisted. These people weren't just broken echoes. They were pieces of her. She rose slowly. You're planning something, she said. The man nodded. The council has begun sealing the roots. They fear the orchard waking. They fear you. We have a chance to act before they flood the archives. With what? He reached into his cloak. Held up a scroll. Marked with the glyph of the council. And beneath it, the seal of forged memory. We stole it before it could be planted, he said. A false memory. Meant for the High Commander of the Eastern Guard. It would have turned him into the council's creature. He offered it to her. This time, we choose where it blooms. Rosha stared at the scroll. Her stomach turned. Even now, the temptation was there. Just a word, a gesture, and they could place it into the mind of someone who would fight back. Tip the scales. Start the fire that might finally burn the council from its perch. But fire did not always burn clean. And false roots could strangle truth before it had a chance to grow. She raised her hand slowly. And pushed the scroll back. Not this way. The man didn't argue. Instead, he bowed. Not deeply. Just enough. Then show us how, he said. And around her, the forgotten waited. Not for war. Not for lies. But for a path forward. Rosha took a breath. And for the first time in weeks, she did not feel alone. The orchard did not wait quietly. It breathed. It pulsed. And it grew. By the time Rosha returned to the grove where she'd first found the sapling, the salt was gone. Not blown away, not dissolved, but consumed. The hill that had once been crusted in pale white dust now shimmered red gold, as though fire had bled into the ground and taken root. The air crackled faintly, like the breath of lightning. And the sapling? It was no longer a sapling. It had grown tall in her absence, trunk thick with new bark that curled like black scrollwork. The branches stretched upward and outward, twisting in elegant arcs. Dozens of fruits now hung from it, each one glowing faintly, each with its own pulse, each marked. Some bore names she did not know. Some bore names she did. Ilareth. Kareth. Luma. Rosha. Her name appeared twice. She stepped forward. The salt crust crunched beneath her boots like thin glass. With every step closer, the world seemed to tilt, not the land, but the air, the sense of what was and was not real. A great stillness wrapped around the tree, the kind that came before thunder or after truth. The fruit-marked Luma hung low. Rosha reached out. Touched it. The memory flooded her, not as a vision, but as a feeling, raw and unfiltered. A mother. Singing. Hiding. Bargaining. sacrificing everything for a daughter who would never know her name. Not because she wanted to forget, but because forgetting was safer. Rosha staggered back. The memory didn't fade. It clung. She took a deep breath and looked again. A new fruit was blooming. She hadn't planted it. But it was forming, stem first, then skin, then light. And it bore no name. Just a symbol. The glyph of the salt-bearers, but inverted. She stepped closer and saw that the bark of the tree had cracked in a single line from trunk to root. Not a wound. A seam. Like something underneath was waiting to open. She pressed her palm to the tree. It was hot. Then the ground beneath her feet pulsed once, not trembled, pulsed, like a heartbeat under stone. The fruits above her shuddered. Leaves fell in slow spirals. A faint keening noise rose from the branches, not quite sound. More like a memory given shape. Then, a whisper. Soft, but spoken aloud. You have remembered enough. Rosha jerked her hand back. The orchard had spoken. Not with language, but with intent. And the message was clear. It no longer required seeds. It no longer needed sowers. It was remembering on its own. The orchard had begun to harvest itself. And if it was harvesting truth, what else might it harvest? What else might it recall? Perhaps not all memories belong to the living. Perhaps not all truths were meant to grow. Rosha backed away. The fruits continued to bloom. Each new one glowed brighter than the last. And in the sky above the orchard, clouds began to form, thick and dark, rimmed with fire. As though the world itself was bracing for what the orchard would next reveal. It began with the wind. Not loud. Not violent. Just strange. It moved against the grain of the desert, curling in slow spirals around the base of the orchard tree, lifting salt dust in shapes that hovered too long, as if reluctant to fall. The leaves rustled, though there was no breeze. The air shimmered, thick with silence. Then came the footsteps. Rosha turned before she heard them, felt them, in the same place she had once felt the thread behind her ear pulse. A figure approached from the far ridge. Barefoot. Clothed in rough linen robes, stained with ash. The woman moved slowly, but without hesitation. Her hair was dark and loose, her posture that of someone newly awoken from sleep or memory. Her eyes locked on Rosha's as she drew closer. And Rosha's world reeled. She knew those eyes. Knew the tilt of that mouth. The line of that jaw. This was impossible. It was her mother. Luma. Alive. But not. The woman said nothing. She walked to the base of the tree and placed her hand on the T. A shoulder. His hand felt real. I remember, he said. Then he, too, touched the bark, and vanished. It was not death. It was return. These were not ghosts in the sense of lingering spirits. They were manifestations, memories so strongly remembered that the orchard had bloomed them into being. Given shape. Given breath. But they did not stay. One by one, they returned to the tree. Back to the source. Back to silence. Rosha stood trembling, heart thudding like a drum in her throat. Then, she saw a child. Tiny, no older than 7, barefoot, holding a glass marble in one hand and nothing in the other. He was not walking. He was staring at her. Eyes wide, dark, ancient. I know you, he said. She dropped to one knee. Who are you? I was planted, the boy said. But I didn't grow. You did. Her breath hitched. Planted, by whom? The boy looked up at the tree. Then back at her. You know who. She did. The council. They hadn't just erased people. They had buried them. planted their memories in hidden soil, hoping they'd rot. But the orchard remembered. And now, one by one, those forgotten were blooming, not as vengeance, not as war, but as presence. Proof. The truth walking on 2 feet. A whisper passed through the grove as more figures emerged from the distant dunes, gathering, returning, touching the tree and dissolving. And Rocha realized. The orchard wasn't just remembering history. It was correcting it. Restoring what had been stolen. But how long before it remembered everything? Before the oldest wound split open? Before the truths too bitter to bear returned? The tree trembled. Its branches swayed without wind. More fruit were blooming. Hundreds. Some already pulsing with names. Others still blank. Waiting. Rocha stepped back, breath shallow. And in the distance, far off beyond the grove, she saw torches rising on the horizon. Marching. Approaching. The council was coming. Not to harvest, but to burn. The wind shifted again. This time, it came with the smell of iron. Rocha stood at the edge of the grove, her hand resting on the bark of the memory tree. It was warm beneath her fingers, pulsing steadily. Not just with life, but with intent. The tree was awake now, fully, fiercely, and what it remembered, it began to share. The fruits above her head glowed like lanterns in a storm. And one by one, they fell. Some landed gently, cracking open on the salt ground like soft eggs. Others struck hard, shattering into light and sound. And from each, a vision burst. Not a dream. Not a whisper. But a truth. A young prince kneeling beside his brother's bed, hands covered in blood, not poisoned, as the kingdom believed, but mercy killed before the council could take him. A healer forced to forget the cure for a plague that had swept through the river cities, so a noble family could sell the antidote in secret. A treaty that had never existed, spoken of in history books, carved into city walls. But planted by salt-bearers into 5 rulers' minds to prevent an alliance that would have ended the council's rule. Each truth struck the air like thunder. And the orchard let them echo. Rocha covered her ears. But she still heard. Not just with her body, but with her blood. With every truth that bloomed, the world outside the orchard shifted. On the horizon, she could see it, caravans turning, birds scattering, sand churning beneath the weight of feet. The council's torchline grew closer, closer than she'd thought. Too fast. They weren't coming to debate. They were coming to end this. Rocha turned to the tree. The glyph of the inverted salt-bearer still pulsed at its base. The wound from which all of this had opened. It wasn't just remembering. It was correcting. She knelt beside a fallen fruit, unmarked, humming softly. She lifted it. And felt herself. But older. Not forward in time, deepened. A version of herself who had made different choices. She saw a memory she had not yet lived. Standing on the steps of a burning archive, torch in one hand, decree in the other. Her face scarred. Her voice steady. Speaking a truth no one wanted to hear. She dropped the fruit. "What are you showing me?" she whispered. The tree did not answer. But she felt its question. "Will you let the truth bloom, even if it burns?" The crowd of returned had grown. Hundreds now stood silently within the grove. The boy with the marble. Her mother's shape. The sharp-eyed prophet from Serre Vale. They watched her. Not pleading. Not afraid. Just waiting. Because she had called this. Not in words, but in remembrance. Caratha's voice returned to her like a wind through hollow bone. The orchard will grow what you bury. And not all roots bloom gently. Her satchel was heavy. The forged fruit Ilireth had offered her, the lie that could have stopped a war, still rested within. She touched it through the fabric. Still warm. Still waiting. She could trade one truth for another. Trade clarity for peace. Erase this orchard before the council arrived. Claim ignorance. Tell the world it had all been illusion. It would be so easy. And the council would reward her. They would shape her into legend. A hero of preservation. A loyal daughter of memory. But the orchard would wither. The forgotten would fade. And the tree, this beautiful, impossible tree, would go silent once more. She looked up. The branches moved without wind. As if nodding. She knew her choice. She rose to her feet. And drew the forged fruit from her bag. She raised it high. And threw it. It struck the trunk and cracked. The lie hissed. The bark sizzled. The orchard rejected it. With a sound like thunder beneath water, the tree shuddered. Then it bloomed, not fruit, but fire. White gold flames spread through the roots, illuminating every truth the tree had borne. The orchard accepted her defiance. And the world would hear it. The torchline crested the final dune. Council riders. Cloaked and armored. Staffs ready. Eyes narrowed. But Russia did not run. She stood beneath the glowing boughs. And behind her, the forgotten stood too. Truth had bloomed. And it would not go quietly. The first arrow didn't whistle. It sang. A high, humming note that shimmered in the salt air as it cut through the space between the dunes. It struck the orchard's outermost fruit, one marked with a name Russia didn't know, and split it cleanly in half. Memory burst into the sky. Not as light. As ash. Grey and curling, it floated down like snow, sticking to Russia's skin, her tongue, her lashes. And where it touched the soil, the salt hissed and pulled away, as if scorched. Ash rain. The council had begun. The riders crested the ridge in tight formation, 12 cloaked figures in bone-white armor, their horses clad in thread-woven veils to protect their minds. At their head rode a woman with a silver staff crowned by a ring of braided light, a memory-severing tool known only as a mnemonic halo. Russia had seen one used once, years ago. It had made a man forget his own name. It had made his daughter forget he was her father. It had made his village forget he ever lived. The woman raised the halo. A voice, amplified not by volume, but by command, cut across the grove. By decree of the Council of Salt and Truth, this orchard is condemned. Its roots are unauthorized. Its fruit unsanctioned. Its memories unverified. Prepare for cleansing. The remembered stood still. They did not flee. They could not. They were the orchard now, threads of it, given flesh. To run was to unravel. Russia stepped forward. The orchard is awake, she said, voice steady. It grows not by hand, but by will. By what was done, not what was permitted. The woman's expression didn't change. Then it will burn. She turned the halo once. The second volley came, not arrows, but needles of light, each aimed not at bodies, but minds. The orchard screamed. Not in pain. In memory. A wave of sound erupted from its branches. Not a sound of agony, but of remembrance. Thousands of voices layered atop one another. Names. Places. Songs. Truths. I was taken. I was silenced. I did not forget. I am here. The light bolts fizzled in midair. The riders flinched. Some staggered. One fell. Russia raised her arms. The sigil on her forearm flared, not gold, but white. It cast light across the salt, catching the council's eyes. I have sown the orchard, she said. I have spoken its name. You cannot unroot what the earth itself remembers. The woman with the halo dismounted. She walked forward, alone. Closer than the others dared. You were erased once, she said. We can do it again. Rosha nodded. I know. She reached into her satchel. Not for a weapon. For a fruit. One of the orchards. One that bore no name, only a crack down its side, as if it had seen something too large to contain. She held it out. You want to silence this place, she said. Then taste what it remembers. The woman hesitated. Just for a breath. Then she struck the fruit from Rosha's hand. It hit the salt. Broke. The world tilted. A storm of memory erupted. Rosha didn't see it. She felt it. Everyone did. It wasn't one memory. It was thousands. Lead. Laced. Stacked like stone. A child dragged from her father's arms. A king's brother laughing on the day he was poisoned. A girl singing in a language no one had spoken in 200 years. A fire that should never have gone out. The riders reeled. One screamed. The woman with the halo dropped her staff. Rosha stepped forward, her voice low. You erased us. You forged history. You planted lies in our mouths and called them peace. She pointed to the remember behind her. And still, we returned. The orchard pulsed. The fruits burned. And the ash fell thicker now. Not of trees. But of lies. Turning to dust in the face of remembrance. The council retreated. Not in defeat. But in fear. Because they had seen now. What happened when memory fought back? They stood in the salt ring at dawn. No bird stirred. No wind moved. The orchard waited, silent. Rosha faced the woman with the mnemonic halo across a circle of carved salt and soot, old lines etched by the salt-bearers, back when memory duels were rare but permitted. The ritual had not been seen in a generation. Its outcome was not death. It was rewriting. One mind would emerge intact. The other, unmade. The duel was not a game of strength, but of anchor. Of how deep your truths reached. How tightly your memories clung to the bones beneath your name. The woman unwrapped her hands. Each palm bore the sigils of cleanse and bind. Her skin glowed faintly with layered protections, memories she had woven into herself to shield her from unraveling. Her gaze was sharp, cold, and utterly still. You should have remained forgotten, she said. And you should have left us buried, Rosha replied. The grove enclosed them. The remembered watched from the ring's edge. Salt-bearers from the deep archive stood behind them, hands resting on the roots. The air shimmered, charged with the pressure of all the truths yet to bloom. Kara stepped forward. He carried no blade this time. Only the ritual flame. A bowl of silver oil burning cold blue. He placed it between them. By the old tongue and the roots that hold us, he intoned, the duel begins. Memory for memory. No edits. No lies. The first to falter shall be unmade. He stepped back. Rosha inhaled. The woman reached across the flame. Touched Rosha's forehead. And the duel began. It started with her childhood. A safe place. A simple place. Rosha gave the woman her earliest laugh, chasing glowflies across the roof of her mother's house. Her toes on warm clay. Her mother's voice singing a lullaby whose words she still did not know. The woman accepted it. Then gave one in return, her first memory of selection, chosen by the council for grooming. She stood in a circle of forgotten children and was the only one seen. She remembered the envy. The hunger. The silence that followed. Back and forth they went. The orchard sapling. The forged fruit. The day Rosha watched her name be spoken aloud again. Then darker things. The fire that took the unrecorded village. The song that forced a ruler's suicide. The way Luma knelt at the council's gates, trading her daughter's memory for her life. Rosha trembled, but did not break. Her anchor held. Then the woman reached deeper. Too deep. She touched the part of Rosha that remembered not herself, but others. The memories of those who had been planted in her. Whole lineages, bound to her bones like vines around stone. Names that never lived past birth. Whole tongues that had no written script. All blooming in her now. It staggered her. But the woman faltered, too. Because Rosha saw her anchor. Not strength. Not belief. But emptiness. Her mind was stitched with borrowed memory. Her childhood wasn't hers. Her loyalty was planted. Her purpose, assigned. She was not rooted. She was crafted. And Rosha pulled. Like a gardener tearing up a weed. She grabbed hold of the false thread that ran through the woman's mind, a memory of being chosen, treasured, uplifted. And she showed her the truth. She hadn't been chosen. She had been spared. The rest of the children had died. And she had been marked not as worthy, but useful. The woman gasped. The circle cracked. Salt leapt in sparks. And her mind broke. Not shattered, but released. Her eyes lost their clarity. Her lips trembled. She staggered back from the circle, dropping her halo, which dissolved into dust the moment it touched the cracked ring. Silence fell. Kara stepped forward again. Raised the ritual flame. Snuffed it out with a breath. The duel is ended, he said. And the orchard stands. The remembered wept. Not for victory, but for continuity. The woman knelt in the dust, hands empty. Rosha stepped forward. Offered her a fruit. Unmarked. Unplanted. But alive. Start over, she said. The woman took it. And for the first time in her life, she chose her own memory. They celebrated through the night. Not with wine or song, but with stories. The remembered gathered around low fires beneath the orchard boughs, telling the truths they had held in silence for years. Names once forbidden were spoken aloud. Old languages flickered into being. One man sang a song no one had heard in 2 centuries, and a child began humming it in perfect harmony, as if it had never been forgotten. The orchard pulsed with quiet joy. Even the wind seemed gentler. But Rosha sat apart. Not because she didn't feel the victory, but because something in her was missing. It wasn't pain. It wasn't grief. It was absence. Since the duel, a sliver of her memory had gone dark. Not an event, not a name, something subtler. A feeling. She could remember the orchard. She could remember her mother's face, the warmth of the memory tree, the truth of her birth. But not the why. Not the reason she had cared so fiercely, so desperately. The core emotion was gone, as if the duel had plucked the root from the soil and left the fruit still hanging, hollow and sweet. She pressed her hand to her chest. It beat steadily. But something behind her ribs felt rearranged. She found Kareth near the orchard's edge, tracing new glyphs into the salt. He looked up when she approached. "You lost something," he said, before she could speak. She nodded. "I can't feel what I meant to feel. I remember everything. But it feels like someone else's life." He didn't answer at first. Just poured a thin stream of oil around his glyph, sealing it. Then he stood. "You broke her," he said, meaning the council duelist. "But you had to give something away to do it." The root she latched onto, that emotion, it snapped under pressure. "And you haven't regrown it yet." "Can I?" she asked. His expression was unreadable. If the soil is deep enough. Rosha looked back toward the orchard. Dozens of new fruits had grown overnight. Some shimmered gently in the breeze. Others had begun to hum. "Will they keep growing?" she asked. Kareth nodded. "The orchard remembers everything now. Not just from you. From all of them. And from itself." She turned to him. "Is that safe?" He gave her a long, slow look. Was truth ever safe? They walked in silence for a time. Then she stopped. "My heart feels wrong," she said. "Like I know I should be angry, or grateful, or something. But all I feel is the shape of what I used to feel." Kareth nodded. "That's the sign of a broken graft." She looked at him. "It means," he said gently, "you grew something around a wound, and now the wound's gone, but so is the growth. The branch needs time. Or it grows twisted." She ran her fingers along her forearm, where the old sigil still glowed faintly. "I don't want to grow twisted." "Then tend the branch," he said. "Plant something new. Not from memory. From choice." That night, Rosha returned to the orchard alone. She took a blank fruit from the tree. Carried it to the grove's heart. Dug a small hole in the salt soil with her fingers. And for the first time since the story began, she planted something not born of grief. Not of loss. Not of fear. But of hope. Just a seed. Just a whisper. No binding spell. No ritual. Just a memory she had never lived yet. A day when no one feared remembering. She buried it. Stood up. And walked into the dawn. Behind her, the orchard pulsed once. The fruit glowed. And something new began to grow. The path was sealed behind for glyphs and a silence oath. Even Kareth hesitated before unlocking it. "There are roots," he said, tracing the last sigil into the stone door, "that were meant never to surface. This is one of them." Rosha stood beside him, torchlight dancing against the tunnel walls. The earth here was different. Not the smooth stone of memory chambers, or the red-veined salt of orchard soil, but black basalt, cracked like old bone. The glyphs did not glow in these halls. They recoiled. "What lies beneath?" she asked. Kareth sighed. The truth the orchard was grown to bury. The door opened. They descended. The tunnel narrowed as it spiraled downward. The air smelled of soot and ink, and something else, something final. A dryness that had nothing to do with weather. They reached a low chamber built from stacked slabs of dark stone. In the center sat a pedestal. On it, a single book, bound in bark black leather, stitched with golden root thread. No title. Just one symbol pressed into the cover. A root. And a flame. Kareth did not touch it. "It's yours," he said. "Your mark bloomed the orchard. Your wound kept it alive. If anyone can open it safely, it's you." Rosha stepped forward. Her palms were sweating. She had opened memory jars. She had seen truth blossom. She had even walked through other people's pain like a blade through silk. But this felt alive. She touched the book. It opened on its own. The first page was blank. The second bled with ink. Aidit myth. Rosha kept turning pages. More drawings. More memories. Not all cruel. Some pleading. A mother planting her child's name in the ground. A man whispering his own story into a hollowed stone. A dying soldier clutching a fruit that had not yet bloomed. And then, a final page. Still wet with fresh ink. The orchard remembers what you are not ready to know. Beneath it, a mirror glass inlay. She saw her own face. Then, her mother's. Then, others. Faces she had never seen, but felt. Anchored in her bones. Rosha stepped back. The book closed. Kareth looked at her with something between pity and awe. "You carry more than your own memories," he said. "You are a vessel for the buried." "What do I do with that?" she whispered. He gave no answer. But the ground rumbled. Far above, the orchard pulsed. And Rosha felt it deep in her spine. Not fear. Not burden. But urgency. The orchard was not just alive. It was awakening others. And if she did not guide what came next, someone else would. The orchard was louder now. Not with sound. With memory. Every tree pulsed with it, like drums in the dirt, hearts in the branches, thoughts whispering down leaves. The grove no longer slept between harvests. It dreamed awake, and in those dreams, Rosha saw shadows moving. Ancients. Ghosts of thought. People who were never born but remembered anyway. And above them all, at the center of the grove, stood the first tree. She hadn't seen it before. Not truly. It had always been half hidden, veiled by the others, cloaked by illusion. But now, it stood clear and tall in the morning light, its bark white as bone, its roots cracked into the salt like lightning strikes. No fruit hung from its branches. Except one. One orb. Larger than all the others. Glowing like a sun behind glass. And marked with no name. Only a glyph burned into its skin. Delta. The first letter of the old tongue. The beginning. Rosha stepped toward it. The orchard quieted as she approached. The remembered watched from the grove's edge. No one followed her. Not even Kareth. Some things had to be done alone. She placed her hand against the trunk. The bark was cold. Not like ice. Like stone. Like memory that had never been softened by the telling. The tree responded. A spiral opened up its trunk, ladders woven into the wood itself, each rung a different color, each a different truth. She climbed. Upward. Past branches heavy with silent leaves. Past flickers of stories that tried to press themselves against her skin as she passed. Whispers wanting to be told. The fruit waited at the very top. It hung just within reach. Perfect. Unblemished. And impossibly still. She reached for it. Hesitated. Then pulled it free. The tree groaned. A sound like old wood breaking, and old voices awakening. She held the fruit in both hands. It pulsed once. Then again. She bit. And fell through time. She was no longer herself. She stood in another's skin. Eyes wide, arms heavy with ink, standing before a circle of saltbearers robed in crimson and white. In the center of the circle lay a child, still and silent, breathing shallow. A prince. A threat. A boy whose memory was too dangerous to let grow. "We erase him now," said the leader. "And plant peace in his place." They stepped forward. Not with blades. With fruit. Forged. Empty. She watched them press one to the boy's lips. Watched the truth fade from his face. Watched his name vanish from the room. Then they turned to her. The one who had harvested the memory first. The one who had taught them how. And she saw her own hands. Her own. Not in body. But in blood. This was her ancestor. The first graft. The woman who took truth and cut it clean. And so began the orchard. Not as healing. As control. The vision ended. She dropped the fruit. It turned to ash. The tree trembled. And so did she. Because now she knew. The orchard had not grown to protect the forgotten. It had grown from the first forgetting. And in her veins ran the ink of the one who started it all. She was heir to the wound. And the knife. And now she had to decide. Would she use it to prune again? Or let the orchard grow wild? The wind changed the moment she stepped back onto the salt. It rolled through the orchard like a tide returning, curling around branches, rustling the leaves with a sound like murmured names. The remembered raised their heads. The salt-bearers paused mid-step. Even the root stirred beneath the soil, vibrating with something more than life, anticipation. Rosha said nothing. She held the memory in her palm. Not the fruit, no, that had burned to ash atop the first tree. But what it had shown her lived still, pulsing beneath her skin, a truth too deep to forget. She felt it like a weight in her blood, like flame behind her ribs. The memory of the first erasure. The birth of the orchard not as a place of healing, but as a tool of control. A wound planted in the ground and told to grow sweet. And now, she was the last graft on that old, twisted tree. A crowd had gathered at the base of the grove. More than remembered now. Travelers, too. Traders from the southern salt ports. A nomad caravan whose memory-marked camel carried an elder who whispered every sentence twice, once for himself, once for the past. People had begun to arrive from the outer lands, drawn by rumors of the grove that breathed, the girl who planted memories, the tree that spoke. Some came seeking healing. Others came to bargain. A few came with torches in their eyes. But all came to see. Rosha walked to the center of the grove. The silence was vast. Behind her, Kareth waited with one hand on the flame bowl, the same one used to open the memory jewels. Ilareth stood beside him now, weathered and worn, the edges of her veil singed by salt wind and guilt. Even she looked uncertain. Even she didn't know what Rosha would choose. Rosha turned, slowly, letting them all see her face. "I have tasted the first fruit," she said. Her voice carried without force, not loud but clear, as though the orchard itself held it aloft. The memory that began the orchard. That seeded the first forgetting. No one breathed. In the age before records, before council and decree, there was a boy, she said. A prince whose memory was stolen. Not to protect him. Not to heal him. To rewrite history. A murmur rose, hushed and rippling. Some stepped back. Others leaned forward. His truth was taken, she continued, and in its place, peace was planted. Not real peace. Managed peace. And that false root gave birth to the orchard. Not as sanctuary. As weapon. As tool. She let the words settle. Then she drew from her satchel a sealed jar, simple, clear, unmarked, and opened it. The air shivered. From the glass rose the memory of the first lie. Not an image. Not a voice. A feeling, certainty. The knowing that something beautiful had been born from something cruel. That peace had grown from forgetting. That even a garden can grow on graves. The memory spun upward like a thin ribbon of fire. And it did not stop. It did not fade. It did not die. It rose above the orchard and spread. Across the desert wind. Across the dunes. Across the world. Toward the cities. The markets. The salt courts and river halls. And there it began to wake others. In the port city of Anvan's crown, a magistrate dropped her ink brush mid-decree, suddenly remembering the name of her mother, who had been erased by the council 40 years prior. In the storm-stepped kingdom of Galbran, a war captain who had never questioned his orders wept openly, remembering the village he had been told was a dream. In a small schoolhouse tucked beneath a crumbling aqueduct, a child stopped reciting her lessons and began to sing a song no one remembered teaching her, but every elder in the room began to cry upon hearing. The world, long silenced, began to speak. Rosha knelt. Not in exhaustion. In reverence. She had opened a door no one could close. She had not just remembered. She had shared remembrance. And now, the orchard lived in more than roots. It lived in people. It would not stop with her. She was no longer the sower. She was simply the first to listen. A soft sound rose behind her. Leaves falling. But when she turned, she saw that the tree was not shedding, it was seeding. Small fruits, pale and pulsing, had begun to drop gently to the ground. One by one. And as they touched the soil, they rolled to the feet of those gathered. Not chosen by Rosha. Chosen by the orchard. Each person who had come was given a memory. Not always theirs. Sometimes a truth they needed. Sometimes a pain they had buried. Sometimes a joy they had never dared to imagine. Some dropped them. Afraid. Others held them close. And a few, just a few, took a bite. The orchard did not judge. It simply gave. And above them all, the branches whispered. Not in words. In memory. And the world remembered. The first city burned at twilight. Not by war. By memory. It began in the harbour town of Terlething, where salt lighters used to sail beneath banners of forgetting. For years, the council had made it their testing ground, implanting softened regrets in dock workers, erasing union leaders, rewriting the storm of a strike as a flood from the sea. But now the people remembered. Not just the lies. The feeling of being lied to. The rage did not come in shouts. It came in song. An old labor chant rose from the fish gutters, passed from lips that had not moved that way in generations. Then came names, the names of those who had vanished, the ones everyone had been told never existed. The names glowed in chalk across the walls. Painted in fire on sails. Etched into ship hulls. And then the salt towers, tall, thin spires where council wardens stored memory records, were pulled down by hand. The smoke could be seen from the northern ridge by dusk. By the third day, 3 more cities followed. In Veltoren, teachers stopped teaching the council's version of history and began reciting the old songs again. In Eldavar, a noble house confessed to harboring memory forgers who had secretly preserved family truths for over a century. In Shale's Hollow, the streets turned red when 2 factions, both remembering correctly, both unwilling to listen, clashed in the name of truth. Because truth, Rosha was learning, was not a single flame. It was a wildfire. And not everyone wanted the same fire in their home. She sat beneath the orchard on the 6th day, watching the horizon smudge with the smoke of distant cities. The sky was no longer pale. It was veined with grey. Not unnatural, but changed. Karath approached quietly. His cloak smelled of ash and rain. "They're asking for you," he said. Who, she asked, though she already knew. The rulers. The exiles. The scribes. The ones who fear what comes next. Rosha didn't speak. He crouched beside her. You cracked the silence. They're afraid you'll finish what you started. She looked up. And if I do? Then the world changes. And if I don't? He looked at the orchard. It changes anyway. But slower. And with more blood. She closed her eyes. What she had unleashed was not a rebellion. It was a return. A pulling up of old roots, and a refusal to let the past stay buried just because the present was more comfortable. But now the orchard was everywhere. Carried in voices. Carried in stories. Carried in seeds. She had not known they would travel so far. She had not realized the fruits would begin to fall on their own. In Teshmar, a girl reportedly found a fruit hanging from her windowsill vine. In Deepfold, a man unearthed a glowing root from the stone floor beneath his cellar. Even in the heart of the eastern provinces, where council influence was strongest, trees had begun to grow where none had been planted. Rosha felt it in her chest. The orchard had left the desert. It was no longer hers. It belonged to the world now. And the world was divided. Some called her a liberator. Some called her a heretic. Some called her a storm. And some still called her nothing at all because they refused to speak of what they could no longer control. But the truth, real truth, does not ask to be obeyed. It simply arrives. And now, it was arriving faster than anyone could stop. They called them ghosts at first. Figures emerging from dust roads, blinking in sunlight. Whole caravans stepping from borderlands no map had drawn. Ships docking in harbors whose registries had long declared them lost at sea. They arrived with languages no one had heard since the first forgetting, with clothes stitched in patterns outlawed before Rosha was born, with songs older than cities. But they were not ghosts. They were the erased. And they were remembering themselves. It began in the eastern corridor of Aramanth, where a Saltwatch patrol reported a procession of pale-robed women moving silently across the dunes. They carried no flags. They bore no weapons. But their feet struck the sand in perfect rhythm, like a heartbeat once buried, now thudding to the surface. When approached, the women raised their palms. Each bore the same brand, a broken tree root coiled into a spiral. The sigil of the first eviction. No one had seen it in over 300 years. Because no one had been allowed to. Not long after, in the high cliffs of Mora's Spine, a forgotten mountain people unfurled a banner made of blood-red silk. The fabric shimmered with woven glyphs that could not be read by any current council dialect. Linguists arrived, eager to decode it, only to discover that the glyphs weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be sung. And when sung, they unlocked visions. Not from the past. From other people's pasts. Not memories the singers owned. But ones they had carried. For generations. Rosha read the reports from her camp beneath the orchard's eldest tree. She felt the weight of each story. Because with every return, a new thread in the world's great tapestry rewove itself, and not all threads agreed where they once belonged. Some returned peoples came with open hands. Others came with grievance. Not every forgetting had been passive. Some had been bargained. Some had been chosen. She met with a council of elders from the White Ravine, a once-erased society whose collective memory had survived through bone-carving and breath traditions. They recited their lineage in full, 13 generations of silence, 12 bloodlines culled from ledgers, and one pact made in desperation. We were given the choice, the matriarch told Rosha, her voice low and flinty. To forget, or to burn. We chose forgetting. And we survived. And now? Rosha asked. Now that you remember. The woman's eyes narrowed. Now we decide if survival was worth the price. That same week, fires broke out in the inner quarters of Urave, where council-aligned historians tried to halt the publication of a new atlas, one that included settlements erased from all sanctioned maps. Scholars fought in the streets. Markets closed. And in the southern ports, books of unrecorded memory were stolen, copied, spread. The world was dividing again. Not into kingdoms. Into realities. One made of remembered truths. One clinging to the sanctioned silence of the past. Russia watched as the orchard's branches spread wider, fruits blooming in colors she had never seen before, some bearing 2 glyphs, some none at all. The air beneath the canopy had changed. It no longer smelled only of salt and fire. It smelled of possibility. And danger. Because the forgotten were not returning to join the world. They were returning to reshape it. And some had no interest in peace. Some had waited generations for the chance to rewrite everything. Even the orchard pulsed with warning now. Its newest fruits burned hotter. Some hissed when touched. One even shattered in the hand of a scribe who tried to preserve it. Truth was no longer content with being remembered. It wanted vengeance. And Russia, for all her efforts to carry it with care, knew that she had released something larger than herself. She had planted hope. But hope, when mixed with fury, grows thorns. She looked to the horizon. Another caravan was approaching. More erased returning. And among them, she sensed something unfamiliar. A presence not of this world, not a memory, not a ghost, but something older. Something the orchard had buried itself. Something even it had feared to remember. The orchard had gone quiet again. Not the gentle hush of resting trees, but a tense stillness, as if the roots themselves held their breath. The wind moved sluggishly between the branches, heavy with unspoken pollen. The usual glow of the fruit had dimmed to an amber haze, like coals beneath ash, and even the leaves seemed reluctant to rustle, folded tightly, as though listening. Russia moved through the grove with bare feet. The salt was cool now, as though the orchard had drawn its heat inward, storing it for something not yet named. She passed rows of fruit she no longer recognized, pale-veined, thin-skinned, some gently pulsing as if alive with breath. Each tree bent slightly toward her, not in reverence, but in warning. They knew where she was going. At the very heart of the grove, beneath the branches of a tree older than the council's founding stones, there was a small hollow, a depression in the earth so smooth and dark it looked as though it had been licked into shape by time itself. No fruit grew above it. No light touched it. The air here had weight. And in the hollow sat the seed. She had not known it was there until the night before, when she dreamed of flame and teeth, of voices too old for shape and faces too blurred for memory. In the dream, she saw herself reach into this hollow with both hands. Not to take, but to awaken. And now, awake, her body remembered the motion. The seed was nothing like a fruit. It was matte. Obsidian dark. No glyph. No breath. No light. And yet, something in it throbbed. Not with sound. With invitation. She knelt beside it. Felt the pull, like silk caught on the edge of a splinter, soft and slow and deep. Her breath grew shallow, chest rising like the tide before a storm. Her fingers tingled. The air curled around her skin, tasting her, testing her, waiting. She reached out. Not all at once. Not quickly. Like brushing fingertips across a sealed letter whose contents might ruin you, or make you whole. When her skin met the seed, it was warmer than it should have been. Not hot, hungry. A shiver ran through her spine. And then, the vision. It did not crash over her like the others. It slid. Slow and curling, like a whisper slipped beneath a door, like fingers tracing a collarbone. She was in a chamber. Stone and shadow. The light came not from torches but from veins in the walls, glowing softly with breathlight, rhythmic as a pulse. A man stood in the center, arms outstretched, his skin inked with runes that crawled. Not symbols of protection, of pleasure, of power taken in exchange for surrender. He was not alone. Around him stood the first bearers, not the council, but those who had taught them. Seen it. The true origin. The seed was not from loss. It was from submission. Not all memory was taken. Some was given, willingly, desperately, in that hot space between control and surrender. The orchard was not just a monument to what was forgotten. It was a shrine to what we longed to forget, even as we offered it up. That desire. That exquisite, aching terror of remembrance. Of being known too deeply. Of being shaped. She touched her chest. Her breath came hard. She looked down at the seed. Still silent. Still waiting. But now she knew what it was. The orchard's first wound. And its most dangerous pleasure. A truth so sharp it had to be buried not just in earth, but in shame. And yet, it had waited for her. Not because she was strong. Because she had cracked enough to let it in. The orchard no longer warned her away. It bent its branches low. Welcoming. The seed did not open. It bled. A slow, syrup-thick thread of ink spilled from the seam along its side, not black, not quite. Shimmering instead with shifting colors that had no name. As the ink touched the salt ground, it hissed softly, and from the sound rose a shape. No image. No body. Just a presence. It filled the grove like perfume in a sealed room, velvety, choking, impossible to ignore. Russia knelt still, hands planted in the earth to keep herself from drifting. Her breath slowed. Her pulse matched the hush of leaves above her. And then the presence touched her. Not skin. Memory. She saw nothing. But she felt everything. The memory had no voice, but it spoke, in color, in temperature, in the subtle ache behind the eyes one gets before weeping for something not yet lost. There was no timeline. No who, no when. Just experience. A child clinging to the hem of someone who no longer existed. A hand pressed flat against a stone wall, fingers twitching in time with footsteps that never arrived. A moment of unbearable joy just before it was erased. Russia's mind reeled. The memory had no shape because it had never been given one. It was not a story. It was a sensation suspended in eternity, raw and uncarved, too sacred for narrative, too painful for names. The salt beneath her knees melted into warmth. The grove bent around her. She did not move. She dissolved. For the first time in her life, Russia forgot herself, not from violence, not from magic, but from proximity. The memory enfolded her like a shawl, like a skin, and in that strange union she felt herself open. To what? She couldn't say. But it was familiar. As if it had always been waiting inside her, curled like a tendril, needing only this moment to uncurl. She floated. She sank. She burned. She bloomed. The orchard blurred. Branches turned to rivers. Leaves to voices. Roots to arms that did not hold but cradled. The feeling was not comfort. It was something far deeper, dangerous in its gentleness, unbearable in its honesty. A memory with no name. Because no name was worthy. She cried. Not from sorrow. From recognition. It was hers. It wasn't hers. It had always been everyone's, and no one's. The original ache. The first hunger. The longing to be remembered without being seen. To be known without having to explain. To exist in someone else's body, if only for a moment, without the burden of being you. And when the memory receded, it did not fade. It left something behind. A mark on the inside of her ribs. A hum at the base of her spine. A soft pulse in the tips of her fingers. She opened her eyes. The orchard stood quiet. The seed had crumbled into fine dust, its purpose spent. And Russia felt empty. Not hollow. Cleared. As if space had been made. She could not speak. There were no words for what she had seen, because she had seen nothing, and everything. Even Kareth, when he found her later, said nothing. He knelt beside her, studied the dust, the hollow in the ground, the soft expression on her face. "She showed you, didn't she?" he whispered. Russia turned to him. Her voice came slowly. "She didn't show me. She became me." And she knew, as she said it, that something in her was no longer entirely hers. The memory with no name had made a home in her bones. And it would not rest. Not until the orchard bloomed everywhere. It began with a child in the Wren Vale who dreamed of salt. A simple thing, hardly worth noticing. A girl with no orchard blood, no mark of memory on her skin, woke one morning with her hands coated in a fine dust that shimmered like snow but stung like tears. Her mother scrubbed them clean, thinking it soot from the baker's vent. But the girl whispered in her sleep that night. "The orchard is awake beneath the stone." Then came the paintings. In the marsh towns along the River Sal, dozens of fishermen began carving unfamiliar glyphs into the hulls of their boats, symbols they claimed came to them in dreams, etched into moonlight, glowing from the surface of the water. When historians tried to categorize them, they found half of them predated the council by centuries. The other half weren't in any known language at all. And in the palace of Serig's Reach, a trusted minister woke with a memory that wasn't hers. She stood in the hall of petitioners, preparing to recite the weekly address, and paused as a feeling washed through her, not fear, not panic, but a presence. And with it, the sudden, unbearable knowledge that she had once been someone else. Someone erased. Someone who had planted a tree in the salt and wept because she knew no one would ever remember her name. The minister fell silent. And then resigned. And disappeared. All across the map, seeds bloomed. Not in soil. In minds. Not as trees. As truths. The memory with no name, what Russia had carried back into herself, was spreading. And not like knowledge. Not like rumor. It moved like longing. A warmth in the chest that refused to leave. A dream you couldn't forget. A moment where everything familiar looked slightly different, edges too sharp, shadows too soft. It was not a virus. It was a desire. The desire to be whole. Even if the pieces didn't match. Russia saw it first in the eyes of those who visited her. Salt bearers came with questions, and left asking better ones. Farmers brought strange fruits, convinced their vines were whispering stories in the night. A sandwalker from the east came simply to sit beneath the branches of the first tree and weep, not for what he remembered, but for what he now knew he had never been allowed to remember. The world was remembering itself. Not as it was told. As it truly had been. And with that remembering came something stranger still. People began dreaming each other's dreams. In Kareth's scriptorium, a student gasped awake in the middle of copying orchard glyphs, claiming she'd just walked the battlefields of the Salt War as a dying soldier, though she'd never studied the era. In a mountain tavern, a drunkard recited a lullaby no one had ever written down, but a traveler from the south recognized it word for word. He'd heard it in his own dreams. Even enemies began to dream the same things. Russia watched it unfold like weather, slow at first, then sudden. Cities that had stood firm in their forgetting began to buckle. Some closed their gates. Others opened them wider than ever before. One empire collapsed in a single week, not from war, but from confession. One of its archivists sang the truth of a royal lineage erased to maintain a false peace, and the public answered not with revolt, but with mourning. And all the while, Russia stayed in the grove. She felt the pulse of the memory with no name growing stronger. Not consuming her. Becoming her. She began to speak in dreams. Not on purpose. She simply found herself there, standing in places she had never been, whispering to people she had never met, planting thoughts like seeds in their sleep. "Truth is not a blade," she said to a child in a walled school. "It is the softest hand you've ever known. And it asks to be held. You are not broken," she told a grieving man kneeling before a council pyre. "You were silenced. There's a difference. You remember because you must," she told them all. And forgetting is not peace. It's frost. More and more, she no longer knew if she was Russia speaking, or the memory itself. She had become both gardener and root. And the orchard was no longer a place. It was a presence. Blooming everywhere. The first stone to speak was not grand. It wasn't a monument or a ruin. It was a step. A single slab of weather-worn limestone set into the temple road in dust mere, smoothed by centuries of sandals, hooves, and silence. One morning, as a boy knelt to tie his sandal, he heard a voice, not in his ear, but in the bones of his knees. "I remember," it whispered, soft as rainfall. He leapt back. The stone glowed for a moment, a faint blush of heatless light, then dimmed. The temple closed its gates. But not before others heard it. Then the riverbeds joined in. Not all of them. Just the dry ones. The dead channels that hadn't seen water in decades. In the north, the old serpentine scar of the Irene River, which the council had long denied ever existed, began to shimmer at night. Travelers camped nearby claimed they heard the sound of running water beneath the earth. One woman swore she dipped her hands in nothing but dust, and felt her childhood ripple through her fingers. The memory of a lost sibling. A name carved into bark, now grown over. A lie told in kindness that bloomed into silence. She wept for hours. All across the forgotten places of the world, the inanimate began to murmur. Not in language. In memory. Salt cliffs cracked to reveal old mural paint, faces that had once been scrubbed clean by decree now peeking through in pastel tones. Statues long stripped of names began to glow faintly under moonlight, as if warming to the sound of their own histories being whispered again. In the valley of Ash Carroll, a canyon known only for its echo transformed overnight. Now, when a voice shouted into it, it did not echo back the words. It replied. Scholars argued over how. Was it glyph resonance? Deep memory encoding in mineral veins? The result of a psychic field seeded by the orchard's expansion? But those who listened closely knew the truth. The land itself had begun to remember. Because the memory with no name, what Russia had stirred, was not content with minds. It had roots. And roots go everywhere. Kara sat beside her beneath the orchard that evening, watching a vine curl up the leg of a fruit-laden bench. They're calling it Memory Fall, he said, scanning a new report from the western dunes. As if it were a season. It is, Russia said. But not one that ends. He looked at her sideways. You're changing. She nodded. I don't feel like I'm carrying the memory anymore, she murmured. I feel like I am it. Not just the one with the truth. The truth itself. He was silent. The orchard around them was blooming out of rhythm. Not in circles or rows, but in spirals, asymmetrical and organic, like it no longer obeyed design. Some of the fruit cracked before ripening, pouring light onto the soil. Others hummed like bees. One, growing at the base of the first tree, bore no glyph, just a reflection. If you looked too closely, it showed you not who you were, but who you could have been if you'd never been erased. Russia stood. She could feel something moving beyond the trees now. A pressure, as if the world were contracting in preparation for a larger breath. "The stones are only the beginning," she said. He nodded, but his expression was grave. If the world starts remembering itself fully, it might not like what it finds. Rosha touched the bark of the oldest tree, now humming softly beneath her fingers. "I know." And she did. Because the next memory waking was not human. It was older. It was buried beneath city walls, beneath throne halls and false altars. And it had waited longer than anyone could measure. It had been betrayed. And it was waking angry. It didn't rise like the others. It didn't whisper from the trees or glow gently in the fruit. It didn't shimmer in dreams or hum behind the eyes. This memory did not seek to be held. It came like a thunderclap. A breach in the salt. A wound in the orchard's root line. The first tree screamed. Not in sound. In loss. Rosha fell to her knees as the ground beneath the grove split in a long, slow breath. The roots twisted. The air cracked. The trees bent inward, not bowing, but bracing. Something was rising from beneath the orchard. Not a person. Not a ghost. A memory that had never been softened. Not recorded. Not shaped. Not touched by language or glyph or ceremony. It was raw. It was angry. And it had been buried alive. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. The hollow beneath the first tree deepened, widened, cracked into a chasm. The salt hissed. Branches curled like frightened animals. A black mist rose, slow, heavy, alive with movement but holding no form. It did not shimmer like the memorying Rosha had seen before. This was darker. Heavier. Like thought turned to oil. Like a secret so vile it had become viscous. Karath ran to her side. "Don't breathe it," he shouted, pulling a woven ward from his satchel. "Don't let it inside." But it was too late. It was already in. Not just Rosha. Not just the orchard. The land. The world. She felt it, like a blade behind the ribs. A sharpness, clean and ancient. A hatred not of people, but of being forgotten. This was not a memory erased for safety. This was one erased because to remember it was to die of grief. She collapsed. And the vision struck. Not gently. It threw her. She was not in the orchard anymore. She was in a chamber of obsidian and bone. A city carved into cliffside and shadow. And fire, so much fire, contained in lanterns, skulls, eyes. At the center stood a throne of salt crystal and iron, and on it, a figure. Tall. Crowned. Faceless. Its skin writhed with memories it refused to share, each one squirming beneath the surface like serpents caught in amber. Around it knelt thousands. Not worshipping. Weeping. She knew their names. Or she would have, if the council had not burned them from the books. This was the first genocide. Not of blood. Of identity. A whole people torn from history, not killed, not enslaved, but made untrue. And here, beneath the orchard, their last thought had festered. It was not. Why? It was. Remember us. But when no one did, the memory turned. It twisted inward. Fed on itself. Became pure. Not longing. Not pain. Just rage. Rosha staggered out of the vision. The mist had grown thicker. It was crawling up the first tree, suffocating the youngest fruits, coiling around the glyphs and scraping them clean. This memory was not content with being seen. It wanted to erase in return. She understood, then. The memory did not want to be remembered. It wanted to remake the world. To burn every orchard. To undo every name. To let silence fall forever, as punishment for the silence it had endured. This was not vengeance. This was balance, drawn in ash. The grove cracked. 3 trees fell in a single breath, their roots torn from the ground, their fruits bursting in midair like overripe wounds. And still the memory rose. A voice sounded. Not from Rosha. Not from Kareth. From the orchard itself. You buried it, it said. And you called that mercy. Now reap what you sowed. Rosha stood. She had no weapon. No spell. Only memory. But it was hers. And the orchard was hers. Not because she planted it, but because she heard it. She stepped forward into the black mist. And it did not devour her. It paused. For the first time. Something in it remembered her. Not her face. Not her name. Her feeling. The way she had once touched the seed with both hands and asked for nothing in return. And the memory hesitated. Because even it had once been human. And maybe, just maybe, it still wanted to be. There was no declaration. No trumpet. No siege lines drawn in the dust. The world simply broke. One morning, the city of Sereth woke up under 2 suns. The first was real, the desert sun, old and merciless, blazing across the salt ridge like always. The second was not. It burned above the eastern gate, golden and flickering, visible only to those who remembered the other version of Sereth, the version where the eastern gate had never been breached during the War of Black Winds. The version where their ancestors had won. But that version was not in the archives. And now, it was bleeding through. People stood in the street, staring up. Some knelt. Some screamed. Some wept, not because they saw something wrong, but because they saw something right that no one had believed. That same day, in the northern city-state of Velas, a 1,000-year-old obelisk cracked clean in half, and spoke. Not metaphorically. It issued a sound that scholars described as a reverse echo, and suddenly half the population could remember a sister empire long denied by council maps. The other half remembered no such thing. And they did not take kindly to being called liars. Soon after, the map wars began. Not with swords, but with claims. Old kingdoms rose in memory. Border disputes ignited not because of land, but because of who remembered what. Cities split in 2. Families fractured. Monuments were destroyed because their inscriptions no longer matched the dominant memory. Children left schools because their teachers could not agree on which path to teach. And all the while, the orchard kept blooming. Not only in the desert. Everywhere. Vines grew through libraries. Glyph fruit burst open on courthouse stairs. Ghost trees took root in the dreams of rulers, blossoming from the ceiling down. Some nations banned them. Others worshipped them. Some tried to burn them, only to find that fire could no longer touch the roots once a single truth had taken hold. Rosha watched from the grove. Not alone. The memory that hated had not left. It circled her now, not like a predator, but like a storm learning to hover. She had not driven it back. She had absorbed it, just enough to hold it still. Every night, it tested her. Every night, it whispered. They don't want truth. They want a better lie. And some nights, she believed it. Kareth returned from a journey to the southern cities with ash in his clothes. Veltoren burned its own orchard, he said. Why? He looked at her, eyes hollow. Because it bore a fruit no one agreed on. Half the city claimed it held the name of a forgotten queen. The other half said it was a demon's trick. A priest bit it. He died. Of what? Too much memory. His body couldn't hold it, Russia closed her eyes. Memory was no longer a gift. It had become a weapon. Not by design. By demand. People were hungry. Not for truth, but for confirmation. And if they couldn't find it, they'd twist the past until it bent to their fear. The shattering was not a war of blood. It was a war of versions. And memory, the very thing meant to unite them, was now the fuel that lit the pyres. She sat beneath the first TR. "Naimor," she asked Russia, "can I still be good?" Russia looked at her, touched her hand, and whispered, "Yes." Because goodness is not memory. It's what you choose to do with it. The hateful memory stilled. For just a moment. And Russia knew. The orchard could not fix the world. But it could plant the chance. One seed at a time. They came not from the orchard. Not from the council's archives or the forgotten cities. They came from the blank spaces. Deserts with no names. Borders that had never been drawn. Villages that had burned before any memory could mark them. The first rootless arrived without ceremony, no banners, no glyphs, no fury. Just silence. A line of 30 walking across the salt flats barefoot, eyes like still water, skin unmarked by memory lines. They spoke in low tones, but only when necessary. They carried no past with them, not visibly, not emotionally. They were not victims of forgetting. They were children of it. Kareth was the first to sense something different. "They don't dream," he whispered, watching them from the grove's edge. "They don't remember. And they don't want to." Russia stood beside him, watching the rootless approach the outer trees. They didn't flinch when a fruit fell beside them and burst in a hiss of golden vapor. One of them, young, perhaps 20, with close-shorn hair and unreadable eyes, walked directly into the orchard. The trees curled slightly away from her, uncertain. She reached for a fruit. It withered before her fingers touched it. The memory inside recoiled. And Russia understood. They weren't just unmarked. They were immune. The orchard could not root in them. And that made them dangerous. Later that evening, the girl, who called herself Nail, sat across from Russia beneath the first tree. The rest of her people waited in a ring just outside the orchard's oldest roots, still and silent. "You're not curious?" Russia asked. "What came before you? Why the world is unraveling?" Nail tilted her head. "I don't believe in before. Only in what's still here. You don't want to remember." Nail smiled. It was not cruel. It was clean. Remembrance is a drug. You keep tasting it, hoping it will change who you are. But it only shows you what you've already been. "We need it to grow," Russia said. "No," said Nail softly. "You need it to justify what you already do." The word struck like salt wind. Nail stood. She walked to the base of the first tree, placed her palm against its bark, and nothing happened. No light. No glyphs. No pull. The orchard did not reject her. It simply passed through her, as though she were not soil enough to plant in. That night, 5 of the oldest orchard trees died. Collapsed inward, not from blight, but from confusion. Their roots could no longer distinguish truth from void. The memory that hated stirred again, not in rage, but in unease. The rootless unsettled it. They did not fear it. Because they had no frame for fear. They had never been part of the story. And now, they wanted to end it. All of it. Not with war. With quiet. Nail left Russia with a message. There is a world waiting beyond all of this. One with no council. No orchard. No remembering. No lies. Just now. We will build it when you are finished burning yourselves alive. The rootless walked back into the salt. Not gone. Just waiting. And Rosha, for the first time, was afraid. Not of forgetting. Not of remembering. But of what comes after both. Because if the rootless were right, then the orchard wasn't a gift or a wound. It was a distraction. The sky turned red on the morning the first tree screamed. Not a natural red, this was the hue of old wounds, of shattered wax seals, of a bloodline written backward through time. The orchard trembled. Birds fled. Fruits fell like rain, splitting open midair with a sound like whispered names being crushed. Something had pierced the roots. Not a blade. A decision. And it had come from Rosha. The night before, she'd sat with Kareth beneath the tree's lowest bough. Neither spoke. The stars above them blinked without rhythm, as if unsure what version of the sky they belonged to. "I can't hold it anymore," she said finally. "The memory that hates. The memory that forgives. The orchard. The stories. They're fighting inside me." Kareth had touched her hand. "And if you let go?" Rosha looked at the first tree. "Then maybe the world decides for itself." But the world was not ready. And so, when she knelt that night and pressed both palms into the root circle, where the oldest truth slept, she did not speak a spell. She did not ask permission. She opened herself. And the orchard bled. Not red. Memory. Golden. Viscous. Streaming from every trunk, every branch, every knot. The fruits began to dissolve, not rot, dissolve, as though their purpose was no longer needed. Glyphs blurred. Visions looped. The first tree arched back. It had no voice, but the sound it made was older than pain. A rending. A birthing. A groan made of centuries. And as its bark split down the center, a single glyph emerged. A word older than language. Truth that could not be tamed. A name erased before names began. The glyph burned. It etched itself into Rosha's chest, searing, silent. Not pain. Exchange. The orchard was giving her everything. Because it knew she would give it back. And from her lips came the command, unbidden. Let the world choose. And so it did. The orchard's magic fled its center. Raced outward like lightning through salt veins. Across the dunes. Into the cities. Over rivers and ruins. Into temples, markets, hearths, and dreams. Every person felt it. A tremor in the chest. A door, just slightly ajar. A choice. To remember what they had once forgotten. Or to close the door and live unburdened. Not one choice was right. Not one was wrong. But the orchard bled for them all. The first tree, its bark stripped and its roots exposed, began to lean. Not in death, but in release. It was no longer needed as a gatekeeper. Not after today. And Rosha, still kneeling in its shadow, felt light. For the first time. Not because the burden was gone, but because she had finally shared it. She looked up. Nail was there. So was the boy from the temple road. And the matriarch from the white ravine. And a girl who had once painted vanished names on ruined city walls. They were all there, walking into the grove. Not to worship. Not to destroy. Just to witness. And beneath them, the orchard bled into the soil. Truth not lost. Not preserved. Planted. In the last season of the orchard's old life, Rosha disappeared without leaving. No caravan bore her name. No witness saw her go. And yet, come morning, the first tree's base was empty. No footprints. No warmth. Only a shallow indentation in the salt where she had once knelt, a hollow shaped like two open palms, and the brief memory of breath. Some say she walked into the roots and never returned. Others say she became the roots. No one agrees. But all remember. Because after the orchard bled, it did not wither. It grafted. Across the world, it slipped from soil into skin. A boy in eastern Calath woke to find his veins shaped like glyph lines, pulsing with light only he could see. A widow in the high hills began speaking a dead dialect, not learned, but recalled. In the southern archipelago, 3 children, none older than 10, began tending a garden that bloomed with memra fruit never planted. And beneath every one of them, the same whisper. Truth is not what was. Truth is what takes root and grows. The orchard no longer needed a grove. It no longer needed guardians. It had become lived. The rootless watched warily at first. Nail stood atop the dunes where once she told Rocha memory was a drug. Now, she saw it for what it had become, a vine without a master. Neither blessing nor curse. Tool. She touched a child's hand and saw a glimpse of her mother's laugh. One she had never known. It didn't hurt. It didn't overwhelm. It simply was. Not history. Not prophecy. Just presence. In Seric's Reach, the rebuilt archives opened their doors, not to guard what was remembered, but to let it breathe. Pages were unbound, copied freely, rewritten in 100 hands. Not fixed, but known. In Dustmere, the stone that had once whispered I remember fell silent, but no one minded. They remembered for it now. And in cities where truth had once fractured the ground, people planted glyph fruit trees in their courtyards, offering the seeds to travelers. Some chose to forget. Some chose to see. But all chose. That was the difference. The orchard had never been the trees. It had never even been the memories. It had been the question. And now that the question lived in every mind, it no longer needed to be asked aloud. Some nights, in the grove where the first tree once stood, salt still glows faintly. A breeze stirs. Leaves rustle that are no longer there. And if you listen, really listen, you might hear her voice. Not Rocha's. The orchard's. Gentle. Fierce. Patient. Grow carefully. And never plant what you're not willing to harvest. And with that, the world turned softly into the salt wind years, a time without calendar or crown, named only for what it left behind, truth in bloom, lies laid bare, and a girl who once traded in memories, but gave the world a future instead. The end. You made it to the end. Or maybe you're already deep in the dream. Either way, thank you for spending your night here in the orchard. If you enjoyed this story, there's more waiting for you. On my channel, you'll find all kinds of bedtime tales, original sleep stories like this one, and some magical ones too. Ever wondered what it would feel like to read Harry Potter's diary? Or what secrets whisper through the walls of Hogwarts at night? I've got those stories. Cozy, mysterious, written just for sleep. So if you haven't already, take a moment. While your eyes are still just a little open, and explore the rest of the channel. There's always another dream waiting. Sleep well. And I'll see you in the next story.